Hello, I'm Robert Pollak, and I'm here to give you a quick tour of the cavalcade of American comic strip art. I've been a comic strip collector since the mid-1960s. I was a student in Ellenville, graduated in 1970, but my interest really peaked with cartooning and the penwork and the cliffhanger stories. Probably around 1967, I started writing to different artists and getting in touch with them. And several of these artists inspired me to go to Pratt Institute and become an illustrator and an art director, a visual merchandiser, and later an educator. I also have always maintained my family's home here. My mom and dad lived here their entire adult lives. My dad was a chef at the Fallsview, my mom was a dressmaker, and I have wonderful memories of the town and growing up here. And I would run to Ritchie's or Cynic's to get the Sunday papers, to cut out the Sunday comics and follow them, because I always had to see what would happen next to Brenda Starr, or Dick Tracy, or Flash Gordon. But what I did also, besides collecting art and meeting artists and putting on shows and curating shows, I also am very fond of Ellenville. It's a great place to grow up. And I did a comic strip. Since we have the Shadowland Theater here, and Ellenville was named after someone named Ellen, I created a comic strip for the Shawangunk Journal, formerly the Ellenville Journal, called Ellen's Adventures at the Shadowland. And this is one of my originals, one of my pen and inks in a cartoon style, not in my illustration style. And this is what it would have looked like in color in the Shawangunk Journal. And my main character is Ellen Allen, and she's an actress from New York that comes to Ellenville to do summer stock at the Shadowland Theater. But there's a lot going on here. UFO sightings are going on here. Different festivals are going on here. We have Sam's Point up in Cragsmore. And so Ellen comes here, and here's a UFO, and she's driving by Kedler's farm. And there's Chomsky, the large elf statue. And some UFO crashes, and Chomsky gets activated by a bolt of lightning, and Ellen loses power in her car and is calling for help, but little does she realize Chomsky, the giant elf, is coming up behind her. So it would say next, the gnome attack. And this is what I like to do for cartoons, because all the cartoons in this show, or 99% of them, are cliffhangers, and I like to do this kind of thing. And this was my tribute to cartooning and to my growing up in Ellenville. What I could say is cartoons are fun, they're inspirational, they're done by really talented illustrators, men and women, and I'm happy to have curated and brought all these originals to Ellenville at the Ellenville Public Library and Museum. There's such a variety of techniques with pen and brushes, and such a variety of characters. It could totally be nostalgic for you if you want to remember them and you read them in the newspapers, or if it's new for you, it could be inspirational and help you get ideas to create your own new works. In any event, please enjoy the show. One of the artists that first influenced me was an artist named Milton Caniff. And Milton Caniff had created Terry and the Pirates in the 1930s. And then in the late 1940s, he left and he created a comic strip called Steve Canyon. I started reading these comic strips, especially Steve Canyon, in the mid-1960s when I was still a student in Ellenville, and you could get many different Sunday newspapers, and I was always enamored by the color comic sections. So I, as a young person, wrote to Milton Caniff, and I had a communication with him for a few years. In 1970-71, there was a cavalcade of comic strips exhibition at Lever House in Manhattan, and I actually, for the first time then, in 1971, met him in person, and he did this sketch for me. And we became friends and pen pals, and when I was an art director at the J.C. Penney Company, he would come up to my office, and he also participated in exhibitions we did there. So Milton Caniff was a very warm and inspiring artist. He's known as the Rembrandt of cartooning, and he created some big strips. He worked on Dickey Dare, then he created Terry and the Pirates, and then he created Steve Canyon. Another artist that I really like, I've always liked Dick Tracy, and the current Dick Tracy artist, Joe Staten, lives not too far away in Kingston, and he did this drawing for me, and Joe is a very good friend, and he lives here in the Hudson Valley, and he's drawing Dick Tracy currently. This is what a Sundae page looks like. There's no words on it because now through computers and technology they drop in the lettering, so it's not hand lettered. But this was done by Joe just for me a few years ago in 2014 of Dick Tracy. Dick Tracy in color with the words, Dick Tracy the original in black and white, and a portrait of Dick Tracy. This piece on top is Little Orphan Annie, better known as Annie, by Leonard Starr. Leonard Starr used to draw Mary Perkins on stage, a very realistic comic strip, but when Annie became a musical on Broadway and became popular, they revived the strip. Instead of Little Orphan Annie, it became Annie, and they inducted, I guess, or got in touch with Leonard Starr, who's a very good draftsman, and he brought Little Orphan Annie back as Annie, and that strip was beautifully rendered and drawn for many years till the strip ended. But the thing about this is Harold Gray created this character many, many decades ago, mid-20th century. Underneath this, we have Brenda Starr Reporter by Dale Messick, and I'm happy and proud to say that Dale Messick was a friend of mine also, and she lived to be 99 years old, and she was a real amazing person. But she created Brenda Starr Reporter in 1940, and Brenda Starr's a red-headed reporter, kind of a red-headed bombshell who goes on all these amazing, unimaginable adventures. And Dale loved to do cliffhangers, and she created some unique characters, but this is an early 1946, I believe. There's a tagline here, and you can see the date is, let's see, 1946, the signature Dale Messick, and the date 7/29, so 7/29/46. So this is a pretty early Dale Messick, and a very beautifully rendered Brenda Starr with her pal Hank O'Hare. Up above here, you have the last year sheet worked on Brenda Starr, which was 1980, and this is from a Sundae page, and here Brenda Starr and Hank O'Hare, many decades later, are still good buddies and working at a newspaper, The Flash, and always on a cliffhanger adventure. When Dale retired, Ramona Fraden, who lived in West Shokan but now in Woodstock, took over Brenda Starr Reporter. And Ramona is a wonderful artist and very detailed, and she really spots the black areas very well and does characters' faces beautifully, beautifully rendered characters. And Ramona took over when Dale Messick retired. I think she drew it for about 15 years, and then it was handed over to another lady cartoonist, and Brenda Starr kind of went into retirement in the early 21st century. Over here we have some science fiction art. Up on top is Brick Bradford in the Time Top, and this is drawn by Paul Norris. And Paul Norris was actually the artist at DC Comics that created Aquaman. But he went into the newspaper, syndicated newspaper business, because that was more lucrative than comic books. That was the top of the line for cartoonists, having a daily and Sunday feature in syndicated in newspapers around the country and around the world. And another big character that lasted a very long time and very popular was Buck Rogers in the 25th century. And this is the top half only of a Buck Rogers in the 25th century Sundae page. So actually it would have been this big, the original art, and of course it would be reduced to about this size for a full page in a Sunday newspaper in color. But here you have some of the supporting characters for Buck Rogers, and this one is actually from, let's see, it looks like about 1947, 1948. This female character, her name is Miss Fortune, and she also came from the 20th century into the 25th century like Buck Rogers did. She was catapulted into the future somehow. And this is Black Barney, the famous Dr. Ewer, the absent-minded but brilliant professor. And this is a classic, Buck Rogers in the 25th century, and this is drawn by Rick Yeager, and this was the model for many science fiction comic strips. When the comic strip was revived in the late 70s, because Star Wars was very popular, a lot of science fiction strips came back. Buck Rogers ended in the early 1960s, mid-1960s, but it was brought back with that whole renewed interest in science fiction comic strips and writing. And Gray Morrow brought back Buck Rogers in the 25th century in a more realistic drawing style. And you can see Wilma Deering, Buck Rogers, a space vampire. It's very interesting, it's very beautifully done, it's much more realistic. This Rick Yeager one would be more Bigfoot style, this is much more realistic style. But when Gray Morrow left to do Tarzan, he handed it to an old pro named Jack Sparling. And here Jack Sparling, and this is the early 80s, is drawing Buck Rogers in the 25th century on a Sunday page. This would be in full color. All of these would have been in full color in the Sunday papers. And the famous characters, Killer Kane and Ardela, the #1 villain and villainess in Buck Rogers, are here in their classic style. From 1929, I think Buck Rogers was created, and it was revived a few times and went into the early 80s. But the classic villain, Killer Kane, very good, with his sidekick Ardela. Okay. I think it was in the late 1960s on television, the TV soap opera Dark Shadows became very popular, and now there's a cult following. Ken Bald is the artist for these two Daily Dark Shadows strips, and these are from 1971. And here you see a beautiful rendering of Barnabas Collins and some of the other cast of characters that were in the TV show. And Ken Bald drew Dr. Kildare before he drew Dark Shadows, so he was familiar with doing celebrity likenesses, and he was a well-known illustrator. So these are two beautiful Dark Shadows daily strips in sequence from 1971 by Ken Bald. Now moving right along, over here we have an interesting strip, Dateline Danger. Again, in the mid-60s, late 60s, there were TV shows like Mod Squad with young people that were undercover detectives. And this has a nice feel to it. It's illustrated by Alden McWilliams, and it has that kind of Mod Squad feeling. There were people of different ethnic backgrounds being undercover detectives, and it was very current and realistically drawn. And what you see here is also a lot of African American characters that are beautifully rendered, and it's a big step. Comic strips like Friday Foster and Dateline Danger brought African American characters into the newspapers in a very dignified and beautiful way. So I think this is beautifully rendered, and it also is very inclusive, and it has a lot of diversity in it. Here's two examples of Dick Tracy. The top one is two daily Dick Tracy strips, and here Dick Tracy is with Little Orphan Annie, and Joe Staton draws this, and the words again are put in now with technology on a computer through Photoshop or whatever they use, but you have a nice picture of Orphan Annie, Dick Tracy, and they're both at a movie theater eating popcorn, looking at old movies from the 1930s. It's a very nostalgic two daily strips in a row. But underneath, we have a full-color Sunday. This was printed in the newspapers. The Sunday News, the New York Daily News, always had Dick Tracy on the front. And you can see this is from 1946, 5 cents. And here's Chester Gould, the original creator of Dick Tracy, drawing and writing the Dick Tracy comic strip with some of the popular characters in there, like Breathless Mahoney, and some of the supporting characters. And over here, you have Dick Tracy and some of his supporting crew working on the case against Breathless Mahoney. And Madonna played Breathless Mahoney in the Dick Tracy movie. These two black and white daily strips, this is from 1948. Milton Caniff had created Dickey Dare and drawn it for many years. Then he left and Colton Wall had drawn Dickey Dare, which was a very popular adventure strip. And for about 2 years, Colton Wall took a leave of absence, and he had Fan Matera draw the Dickey Dare strip. This is 1948, and whoever drew Dickey Dare, whether it was Milton Caniff or Colton Wall or Fan Matera, this is the classic face of the kid with his mentor, Dan Flynn. So this was an older guy, an adventurer, and his sidekick going all over the world having wonderful adventures. And this is a beautiful example in black and white of the main character. Underneath it is another kid's strip. This is Dondi by Irwin Hazen. And Dondi was in the New York News along with Dick Tracy and in many newspapers. And Irwin Hazen did a beautiful job bringing this little Italian immigrant kid to life daily in the newspapers. A lot of people in my generation really used to look at the full page of Dondi in the newspaper, the New York Daily News, and Sunday News was the full page on the back, just like Dick Tracy was the full page on the front. Dondi was popular, and they even made a movie, I think, in the late 1950s on it. This strip is Ella Cinders by Charlie Plum and Fred Fox. Ella Cinders was kind of a Cinderella type of story, and this ran for many, many decades in many newspapers. It was highly syndicated, but Ella Cinders was always kind of the working girl and helping people and stuff, but somehow because Ella Cinders was like Cinderella, she'd end up in very glamorous situations at Hollywood premieres or appearing somewhere at the end of an adventure in glamorous garb. And it was a very interesting character, and what's unique is she has these big round eyes with like 4 big eyelashes, 2 dots for her nose. It's very Bigfoot style, but Ella Cinders made it, I think, into the 1960s, and she had a long life in the comic strips, and she always had that face, but her hair would change like every 5 years or every decade to be more contemporary with what women were wearing that was fashionable. So this one looks like it's from, let's see, this one is from 1949. So basically, you know, the ladies had bangs and short bobbed hair and put a bow in their hair, and that's what Ella Cinders is doing while she's in the kitchen with her dad. It's not a glamorous one, but it's a very typical Ella Cinders story. Besides Buck Rogers in the 25th Century, which was one of the top science fiction comic strips, the other top one, which overpowered in a way because of the art, Buck Rogers, was Alex Raymond's Flash Gordon. These are not by Raymond, these are by some of his successors. This is the Flash Gordon from the mid-1950s by Mac Raboy, and you could see this is all brushwork, very fine brushwork, but if you took a magnifying glass, you could see almost every hair drawn on Flash Gordon's head. So Mac Raboy was a very realistic and very detailed artist, and he was known to be he was a well-known woodcutter, and some of his woodcuts and prints are in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. After Mac Raboy passed away, they got Dan Barry to draw Flash Gordon, and this is a more contemporary look. And I had met Dan Barry, and he signed this for me. And I think it was 1990 something. But here you've got a very handsome Flash Gordon, and it's not Dale Arden, it's another female that's traveling through time with him. Instead of on a spaceship, they're on a flying saucer. And here Flash goes back in time to like the Greek warriors, and people from the future come to rescue him. So it's kind of an interesting sci-fi story, and Flash Gordon was one of the comic strips that almost everybody knew. Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers were the 2 premier comic strips. Here's Flash Gordon by the last artist to draw him, Jim Keefe, and in this one, I was teaching at this time, and I became friends with Jim Keefe, and he came to visit my students, and what he did was we talked about Flash Gordon and the Planet Mongo and your favorite characters. Mine was Queen Azora, the Witch Queen. So he did a story with Queen Azora, the Witch Queen, and this is me working for Queen Azora in 1999, and I'm trying to get magical powers. And I get them, but it transforms me into an ancient sorcerer that's a lizard-like creature. And of course, I'm jealous of Flash Gordon because I think he likes Queen Azora, so I become a lizard-like sorcerer who's an adversary for Flash Gordon on the planet Mongo. So I became a comic book villain, a comic strip villain, sorry. Okay. Here we have a Joe Palooka Sundae page by Ham Fisher. And Joe Palooka was a boxer. And in the comic strip, he was a really good guy. He was a strong guy, he was a champion, he was a boxer, but he had a big and kind heart. So there used to be a term, oh, he's a good Palooka. That means you're a good guy. You're big and you're strong and you're kind of considerate of people around you, and you're nice to and helpful, and you just know when to say please and thank you and be helpful. So Joe Palooka, kind of, you get the term, oh, he's a good Palooka, like what a good guy. He's strong, he's successful, but he's never too big to help anyone out in a situation. And here you don't see him as a boxer, but you see him in a bow tie and a suit on an airline, which is really nice because this is from the mid-50s, so you get a mid-1950s airplane there. And you have this woman who's badgering her husband about something, and he at one time obviously had some kind of a claim to fame, but his wife is like saying like, what's wrong with you? What's wrong with you? You're not important anymore. And Joe Palooka, who's a famous boxer, sees that, so he goes up to this character and says, can I have your autograph, sir? He didn't like that the wife was making a mockery of her husband because he wasn't famous or big at the moment. So Joe Palooka says, oh yeah, I know you, can I have your autograph? And she's like, oh my, Joe Palooka came up to ask for your autograph? And he said some really nice things, and it ends up, what were you saying when Mr. Palooka came over, Cecilia? Nothing, nothing. And Joe Palooka got the autograph, and he straightened them out. So she stopped badgering her husband because Joe Palooka did a good deed. Okay. This is Mopsy by Gladys Parker. And actually Gladys Parker modeled the character Mopsy after herself. So if you look at Mopsy, you've actually met Gladys Parker. She's a very well-known female cartoonist. And Trina Robbins, who does the history of women cartoonists and artists and illustrators, we call Trina Robbins a historian. She just came out with a book on Mopsy by Gladys Parker, and it's beautifully drawn, very simple and clean lines, very smartly spotted black areas. And what would happen on a Sundae page, like with Brenda Starr, also with Mopsy, if you got the full page layout, you would have a paper doll with it. So it depended how it was printed in the newspapers. Usually you just saw this part, but if a big paper like the Journal American carried Mopsy and gave her a half page, this would be a half page in full color with the paper doll. Okay, over here we have Robin Malone by Bob Lubers. Bob Lubers drew many famous strips. He drew the Tarzan comic strip in 1950 to 53. Then he worked with Al Cap, who created Little Abner, and created Long Sam, which was written by Al Cap and illustrated by Bob Lubers. And it was like a female Little Abner, kind of a hillbilly girl who was smarter than people thought. And it lasted till about the early 60s, starting in the early 50s to the early 60s. But he went on from there to create Robin Malone for 3 years, and this was actually in the Poughkeepsie Journal, and I used to get it in the Poughkeepsie Journal in 1967, 68, and 69. And this is a black and white original by Bob Lubers of Robin Malone. He wrote and created her, and this was one of his favorite strips, and Robin Malone, too, was a redhead, kind of like Brenda Starr. Underneath this, we have a showcase with lots of objects. We have drinking glasses here with Brenda Starr, Smiling Jack, Terry and the Pirates, Moon Mullins, Little Orphan Annie, Gasoline Alley, bobbleheads of Flash Gordon and Dick Tracy. We have some original artwork. This is Buck Rogers and Wilma Deering by Leonard Dworkins, and Leonard Dworkins was Rick Yeager's assistant on Buck Rogers, so they worked together all through the 50s on it. And here's a Mopsy by Gladys Parker. Excuse me. This was a daily strip. She did one panel for the daily strips, and it was always Mopsy in kind of a romantic situation with some guy or some kind of situation where she would say something a little off color, and it was kind of the humor of that time that Gladys Parker wrote. Famous Funnies comics are in here. Famous Funnies was the first comic book, and it's Famous Funnies because the funnies from the Sunday papers and the daily papers were so popular because there was no computers and TV. People had radios and movies once in a while, so the comics were a big seller in the newspapers and helped to sell a lot of newspapers. So they took things like Buck Rogers in the 25th Century and Invisible Scarlet O'Neil and Scorchy Smith and reformatted the artwork and put them into comic book form. Later on, the superheroes came about, and that was new material, but the original comic books were reprints of the comic strips that were in newspapers. We'll start up on top here with Kerry Drake by Alfred Andriola. This was a well-known detective strip, and this is the original pen and inks again in black and white, and it would be in the Daily News, Sunday News, in full color, half-a-page format. Underneath it is a daily Al Cap Little Abner. This one has Mammy Yoakum in it, and this is an early one. This is from I look at the tagline here and I see it's 1936. So this is a 1936 Little Abner. And if you remember earlier I spoke about Long Sam, which was the female version of Little Abner, written by Al Cap and then drawn by Bob Lubers. But this is early on in Al Cap's career, drawing Little Abner featuring Mammy Yoakum. Underneath it is a wonderful piece by Jimmy Hatlow. He did They'll Do It Every Time, and then he created Little Iodine. And Little Iodine, just from her name, you could figure out if you cut yourself or scrape yourself, you put on iodine and it burns. So here we have Little Iodine. So whatever she does is kind of a fun strip, and Little Iodine always leaves a little burn in her last statement with the adults she's involved with. So this is kind of a fun strip by Jimmy Hatlow. And Little Iodine, let's see, here she is, very beautifully drawn, very stylized in a Bigfoot style. And here she solves the problem for the adults by taking care of everything they wanted her to do, and she ends up with a smile on her face while the adults are basically freaking out. Over here we have a very serious strip. This is Leonard Starr drawing Mary Perkins on stage, beautifully drawn strip, syndicated in a lot of newspapers, including the Sunday News. This is a Sunday page. This is Mary Perkins. If you recall earlier, I said Leonard Starr ended up being the artist to draw Annie when it was revived. So this is his very realistic style. He's a great draftsman, and he applied that talent of his and skill to the Annie revival, but he drew the faces with Little Orphan Annie characters and Daddy Warbucks characters with the round blank eyes. Here it's all very realistic, photorealistic, and you can see how talented and how flexible he was as a cartoonist. Underneath we have the Phantom. This is the first masked hero that was created by Lee Falk, and this one's illustrated by Cy Barry. Cy Barry is a very talented artist. His brother Dan Barry did the Flash Gordons, and he does the Phantom for several decades. Up here we have an oldie, Moon Mullins by Frank Willard. This one is from 1937, and here's Moon Mullins, kind of a character strip, smoking his cigar, having kind of a derby hat on, and always kind of a slapstick kind of style and comedy and writing to it. Underneath it is Hal Foster's Prince Valiant, but this one is drawn by his successor, John Cullen Murphy, who used to draw Big Ben Bolt, a boxing strip. But here he inherited Prince Valiant from Hal Foster, and he does a beautiful job illustrating the knights and castles of King Arthur with Prince Valiant, Queen Elida, and their son, and some pirates following them. And you can see it's a pirate ship with the skull on the sail of the pirate ship that's following Prince Valiant. Over here we have a comic strip that a lot of people haven't heard much about. It's called Rudy, and it's done by William Overgard. And William Overgard, this was his dream strip, and he did it for about 2 years, and it was in the 1980s. But before that, he had drawn a famous comic strip in the newspapers, and that's over here. It's Steve Roper. So William Overgard had 25, 30 years experience drawing Steve Roper, who was an investigative reporter for the newspapers and magazines, and he had a great career. But when he left this, he went to do Rudy, and Rudy is a talking chimpanzee from the vaudevillian era, and it lasted 2 years in the 80s, but it's beautifully rendered. Underneath we have Secret Agent X9, or Secret Agent Corrigan, and this is drawn by Al Williamson. Al Williamson drew beautifully, very realistic Mustang here, and the characters and the darks and the cross-hatching. This is really a nice piece, and this one is from 1974. Al drew in this smaller size, and then he also drew bigger, but this was only a daily strip, never a Sunday comic page, always Monday through Saturday. Up on top is Snuffy Smith by Fred Laswell. Fred Laswell was one of the artists who, he lived in Florida, but he flew to New York, and he came to talk to my students and do art with them. And it's Snuffy Smith and Barney Google, and here's Snuffy Smith in one big panel with all the cast of characters here, and done in this very unique style. And like little Abner, Snuffy Smith was a hillbilly and had kind of one-liners and fun jokes and just making fun of people in life in a very kind way. Underneath we have more contemporary. This is drawn by Alex Saviak, who's drawn many comics for Marvel and DC. He ended up doing the Sunday Spider-Man comic strip while it was still around. It just recently stopped. And this is from Alex Saviak, inked by Joe Sinote and written by Stan Lee. Over here we have Starhawks, modern science fiction strip around the time that the Buck Rogers comic strip was revived by Gray Morrow. Starhawks was brought back by Gil Kane. But this one is ghosted by Ernie Colon because Gil Kane was sick for a few weeks, so Ernie Colon stepped in and drew Starhawks beautifully to help Gil Kane out. And again, underneath is Steve Roper by William Overgard, who also did Rudy. Up on top we have the world's greatest superheroes, really the Superman comic strip, and here it's illustrated by George Tusker, who illustrated many Marvel comic books like Iron Man, and he also drew Buck Rogers in the 1960s. So George Tusker had a very long and prestigious career in the comic strip business and the comic book business. And because I knew George, I had asked him to hand watercolor this. So here's the Sundae page, hand watercolored by the artist. And it's really nice. It kind of comes to life, and it has the artist's own touch to it. Underneath we have something a little bit older, Tiny Tim by Stanley Link, and this is from 1940. And Tiny Tim was a young boy, and he doesn't shrink in this, but he had the powers like the Atom or Ant-Man. He could shrink down in size and fly on birds and things like this. But in this instance, he's saving a classmate from causing an explosion, but the headmaster of the school catches him after he knocks out the kid who wouldn't listen, and he gets suspended, but he actually saved the boy's life. And in a future page, you realize he was redeemed and looked at as a hero, but here he gets punished for being the hero. Over here are the two oldest strips in the show. This is Toots and Casper by Jimmy Murphy, and this is from 1931. And Toots was kind of a blonde-haired, beautiful young woman who married a slightly older guy who was goofy. And Toots and Casper ran for at least, I think, 2.5 decades, but this one is an early one. It's from 1931, and the oldest piece in the show is this one by Martin Branner. It's Winnie Winkle, the breadwinner, and this is Winnie Winkle, and this is from 1929. And what's interesting about this piece is Martin Branner used to travel through Ellenville to go to Yama Farms for vacations, as a lot of famous people did at this time period. And he actually met one of the original librarians from the library that was at the Hunt building when she was young, and he did a drawing and a card for her with a little sign with her and Winnie Winkle and a sign saying "To Yama Farms." So here's Martin Branner, who went through Ellenville to go to visit Yama Farms for vacation. 1929, his famous strip, Winnie Winkle, the breadwinner. This wall has the actual printed Sunday pages in full color from the newspapers, and I had them laminated so people could see what the printed product was like, because all the originals were done in pen and ink in black and white. Here you have Buck Rogers in the 25th century, Flash Gordon, full color. Here you have Steve Roper and Mike Nomad, full color. Prince Valiant by Hal Foster, full color. Dick Tracy, Snuffy Smith, Robin Malone. I think it's important to look at these in full color so you see the skin tones, the hair colors, and the primary colors that went into printing in the newspapers when they did the Color Sunday section. On this side you have other strips, Dondi, Brenda Starr, definitely, she's a redhead. Dale Messick's Brenda Starr. A later Flash Gordon, the sizes got smaller as the decades progressed. And the Phantom from the 1950s here. And Brick Bradford in the Time Top. Captain Easy. Snuffy Smith. All full color Sunday comic pages, but they were drawn in black and white, much larger, and you could see and enjoy all the beautiful pen and ink work that these illustrators have. Thank you.